These are the 13 New York towns that were buried underwater. Starting with number 13, Bittersweet, Sullivan County. We begin in the mountains, and we begin with a name, Bittersweet. It is possible that no town in American history ever had a name that fit its fate so precisely. Bittersweet was a small hamlet in Sullivan County in the Catskill Mountains, sitting in the narrow valley of the Neversink River, about 90 miles northwest of New York City. It was not large. It had a few dozen families, some farms, a general store, the kind of community where people knew each other's cattle by name. What made Bittersweet notable was its neighbor, the larger hamlet of Neversink, and the fact that both of them were about to disappear together. In 1941, New York City announced the construction of the Neversink Reservoir as part of its expanding Delaware watershed system. Construction was largely halted during World War II, but resumed in 1946. When it resumed, neither Bittersweet nor Neversink was going to survive it. In all, 340 people were evicted from the valley and 6,149 acres condemned. The process was meticulous and deliberately sterile. The city dug up barnyard manure, disinfected outhouses, cut down trees, filled in cellars, and burned or bulldozed almost everything standing. The whole operation was conducted with the same institutional coldness that would come to define New York City's relationship with the towns it swallowed over half a century. On June 4, 1953, the Neversink Reservoir began to fill. It took 2 years to reach capacity. Bittersweet went under and stayed there. The name Neversink was eventually given to the reservoir itself and to a relocated town built on higher ground nearby, which exists today along Route 55 in Sullivan County. Bittersweet was given nothing. It simply ceased to exist. The most bitter detail, and there are several, is that the town called Neversink sank and the town called Bittersweet tasted exactly what its name promised. Moving on to number 12, Granton, Delaware County. Granton was one of 5 communities in the West Branch Delaware Valley that New York City decided it needed more than the people living there did. It sat in Delaware County in the Catskill foothills, a small place, a cluster of houses, a store, a church, a Sunday school that once drew enough people to fill a postcard in 1910. By the early 1950s, when New York City announced the Cannonsville Reservoir project, Granton had already been in slow decline for decades, its timber industry exhausted, its acid factory shuttered since the 1920s. What remained was a dairy valley, quietly productive, multi-generational, rooted. The announcement that the city intended to flood the entire West Branch Valley hit in late 1949. The Delaware County Board of Supervisors passed a resolution against it almost immediately. The valley contains more than 100 dairy farms, producing over 2 million gallons of milk per month. None of that mattered. New York City claimed 19,910 acres under eminent domain. Property owners were compensated, usually at less than the asked. Construction on the Stilesville Dam began in 1955. Residents were required to vacate by 1962. Granton went the way all 5 of those communities went. Houses burned or bulldozed, roads torn up, cemeteries relocated. 11 cemeteries across the valley contained 2,150 graves. All of them were moved. At night, according to people who watched it happen, fires glowed throughout the valley as the clearing crews worked. The reservoir began taking water in 1964 and was placed into full service in 1965. Today, Granton exists in one photograph from a 1910 Sunday school convention and in a Facebook group called Lost Towns of the Cannonsville Reservoir. Researcher Mike Show, who has spent years documenting the valley, found that the old double-span Granton Bridge was never demolished. It is still down there, under the water, intact. On to number 11, Rock Royal, Delaware County.
Rock Royal's entire claim to distinction in the years before the reservoir was a cooperative creamery it opened in 1938, the Rock Royal Creamery. The Royal Creamery became the pride of the West Branch Delaware Valley, a symbol of what dairy farmers could build together when they pooled resources. By the time the city's condemnation proceedings began in the late 1940s, the creamery had 153 members. 50 of those members would lose their land to the reservoir. Rock Royal was not much more than the creamery and a handful of houses, but size was never the point. The point was that people had organized their lives around it, built institutions, created something cooperative and self-sustaining in a hard valley with thin soil and short growing seasons. A Catskill Mountains author once described the region with the title of a local history, "Two stones for every dirt." The people of Rock Royal had made something out of that dirt. New York City took it. When the Cannonsville Reservoir filled, Rock Royal went under 75 feet of water. The creamery that 153 farming families had built together sank with the rest of it. The 941 residents displaced from all 5 West Branch communities, Rock Royal, Granton, Rock Rift, Bearston, and Cannonsville, scattered to other towns in Delaware County and beyond. Broome County historian Roger Luther, who has researched and presented the story extensively, put it plainly. Lands that for nearly 200 years had provided a home to 8 generations of residents were hidden. And when you drive past the Cannonsville Reservoir today, it looks like a picture postcard. There is no way of knowing from the surface what is underneath. Coming up at number 10, Bearston, Delaware County. Bearston was the southernmost of the 5 communities condemned for the Cannonsville Reservoir, sitting at the lower end of the West Branch Delaware Valley near the dam site itself. It was a small community, farms, a few houses, people who had been in the valley for generations. What makes Bearston worth mentioning separately is what it shared with all 5 of these communities. Not just the flooding, but the deliberateness of the erasure. When the city cleared the Cannonsville Valley, nothing was left standing. No ruins, no foundations, no chimneys. Every house, barn, business, church, and school that had not been physically relocated was either demolished with bulldozers or burned. The fires burned at night, and the smoke rose into the Catskill Hills for weeks. Unlike some reservoir projects elsewhere in the country, where the waters eventually recede during droughts and old foundations briefly resurface, the Cannonsville scrubbing was so thorough that researchers today find almost nothing underwater. There's nothing to surface. When the reservoir drops, all that comes back is sediment and the old outlines of roads. Bearston and its neighbors were not just flooded, they were unmade. The valley that had held 74 farms, 2 creameries, 6 stores, 3 restaurants, and a community hall was reduced to 95 billion gallons of drinking water for a city most of the valley's residents had never lived in and never particularly wanted to supply.
Up next at number 9, Rock Rift, Delaware County.
Rock Rift was the liveliest of the 5 condemned West Branch communities, which isn't saying much by outside measures. It had a population of only about 100 people, but by valley standards, it had genuine personality. There was a butcher, a baker, 2 taverns, the nearest town of Walton was dry, so Rock Rift was where you went, an Italian restaurant, a general store, and a church. Many of Rock Rift's residents lived in former acid factory company houses left over from the timber and wood chemical industry that had dominated the valley before it played out in the early 20th century. What makes Rock Rift's story worth telling separately is the songwriter it produced. Grant Rogers was born in Walton in 1907 and spent much of his adult life in and around the West Branch Valley. When the city's taking began, Rogers watched the valley he knew go under. He wrote songs about it, folk songs in the Catskill tradition, recorded in 1965 by folklorist Sandy Payton for a record called Catskill Mountains Songmaker. His wife Edna had been born in Rock Rift. She watched her birthplace disappear under the reservoir water. Researcher Mike Show confirmed that old Route 10, which ran from the dam site through Rock Rift, lies almost entirely submerged beneath the reservoir today, along with telegraph poles and the remnants of rail trestles that the clearing crews never removed. Rockrift had about 100 people when the condemnation came. It had a butcher and 2 taverns, and a man who wrote songs about loss. The song survived. Rockrift didn't. Moving on to number 8, Lackawanna, Ulster County. Lackawanna sat in Ulster County at the edge of the Rundout Valley, about 75 miles northwest of New York City in the rolling terrain where Rundout Creek wound south through the Catskill Hills. It was one of 3 communities, along with Montella and Eureka, that were condemned and flooded to create the Rundout Reservoir beginning in 1937. What distinguished Lackawanna from its neighbors was its age. The community had been settled for generations and had the kind of deep local roots that show up in old property records and genealogical files, rather than in dramatic historical events. Property owners in Lackawanna, like those in Montella and Eureka, were required to file claims for the value of their land. They were usually paid less than half of what they asked. The city also paid 6 months of lost wages for businesses forced to close because of the project. A small and somewhat insulting acknowledgement that the destruction of a community had economic consequences. An attempt by the nearby village of Ellenville to block the reservoir on the grounds that it would harm the future public health, welfare, and development of the village did not succeed. When the Merriman Dam closed on Rundout Creek in 1951 and the reservoir began filling, Lackawanna, Montella, and Eureka went under together. The Rundout Reservoir today is 6.5 miles long and holds 49.6 billion gallons. It serves as a central collection point for New York City's entire Delaware water system, receiving water via tunnel from the Cannonsville, Pepacton, and Neversink reservoirs before sending it all south through the Delaware Aqueduct, the longest continuous underground tunnel in the world at 85 miles, to the city's Hillview Reservoir in Yonkers. Lackawanna, Montella, and Eureka sent their water to New York City without ever being asked. On to number 7, Montella, Ulster County. Montella sat between Eureka and Lackawanna in the Rundout Valley, straddling the Sullivan-Ulster County line. It had a general store, a post office, a hotel, an Excelsior mill that produced wood shavings for packing material, and a grist mill built in 1839 in the neighboring hamlet of Eureka that Montella residents also used. What you notice when you look at photographs of Montella before the flooding is how ordinary and dignified it was. Not a prosperous place, but a complete one. Houses with porches, a school with children lined up out front, a hotel on a dirt road. One of the stranger details of Montella's geography was the County Line Hotel, which literally straddled the Sullivan-Ulster County line, half of the building in the town of Neversink, the other half in the town of Wawarsing. Because Neversink was a dry town, the hotel bar could only legally operate on the Montella-Wawarsing side. The barbershop occupied the Neversink side. The county line ran straight through the building like a jurisdictional joke, and everyone just worked around it. Over 250 families were displaced by the Rundout Reservoir project across all 3 condemned communities. Many were descendants of families who had been in the valley for more than a century. Grandchildren of those residents still share photographs and memories in online groups today. One commenter recalled that his Irish grandfather was a steam shovel operator who lived in Montella until the town was flooded, after which he moved his family to Napanock. His mother had many fond memories of growing up in Montella, the commenter wrote. She carried them for the rest of her life. Up next at number 6, Eureka, Sullivan County. The name Eureka means I have found it. The exclamation attributed to Archimedes when he discovered the principle of water displacement. The irony of a town called Eureka being displaced by water is the kind of thing that sounds invented. It is not. Eureka sat in the town of Neversink in Sullivan County, the easternmost of the 3 communities condemned for the Rundout Reservoir. It had a church, a school photographed with teacher Nancy I. Moore and her students standing in front of it before the flooding, and the Brundage Grist and Flour Mill, built in 1839, which ground grain for the surrounding valley for a century.
When the reservoir project came, all of it was classified as an obstacle. The city's clearing process for the Rondout Valley was thorough to the point of obsession. Not just buildings, all structures, all fences, trees, hedges, even tall weeds and roads were removed or dug up to maintain the purity of the future water supply. The underlying logic was sanitation. New York City's water reputation depended on the cleanliness of its Catskill sources, and anything organic left in a future reservoir basin was a contamination risk. The result was that the Rondout Valley was scraped to bare earth before the water came. Eureka, the mill, the school, the church, all of it was erased before a single drop of reservoir water touched it. What the city found in that valley in the end was drinking water. Coming up at number 5, Gilboa, Schoharie County. Gilboa is the oldest story on this list, and in some ways, the most geologically extraordinary. The town sat in Schoharie County along Schoharie Creek, about 35 miles southwest of Albany, at the foot of the northern Catskills. By the early 20th century, it was a modest community of several hundred people with homes, businesses, churches, and a small town life organized around the creek and the surrounding farmland. But Gilboa sat on something ancient. When a flood scoured the riverbanks in 1869, it exposed fossilized tree stumps dating back approximately 380 million years to the Devonian period, some of the oldest fossil trees ever discovered. Scientists later identified the Gilboa Forest, as it came to be known, as one of the earliest known forests on Earth. The town of Gilboa was sitting on top of the beginning of terrestrial plant life. In 1917, New York City acquired the village and surrounding 2,435 acres under condemnation. The Schoharie Reservoir, it was determined, would be built here. The demolition was systematic. About 400 buildings, homes, and businesses were burned. The dead in the cemeteries were exhumed and moved between 1918 and 1921 to a new Gilboa Rural Cemetery on higher ground. The main street of the village was raised in October of 1925. The dam was completed in 1927 and the Schoharie Reservoir filled behind it, 5 miles long, holding more than 17 billion gallons. Gilboa disappeared under approximately 57 feet of water. A local account from the period describes one family making several trips back from their new home to collect belongings. On their final trip to retrieve the bedroom furniture and a doll collection belonging to a 7-year-old girl, they arrived to find their house already burned. She was 7 years old. People who lost their homes in Gilboa, according to the town's own historians, never forgot the anger and the trauma. And during droughts, when the reservoir drops, traces of the old village still emerge from the water. The ghost of a community that was sitting on the world's oldest forest, which is now under 57 feet of New York City drinking water. Moving on to number 4, Neversink, Sullivan County. We have to talk about Neversink separately from Bittersweet because Neversink was the larger of the two condemned communities, and because its name has become the defining symbol of everything New York City did to the Catskill Valleys over the course of half a century. Neversink sat in Sullivan County along the Neversink River, which took its name from a Lenape word meaning either continuously flowing or simply the place. By 1941, when New York City began condemnation proceedings in the valley, Neversink was a functional rural community with churches, farms, businesses, and a post office. In all, 340 people were evicted, 6,149 acres were condemned. The clearing operation, as with every city reservoir project, was exhaustive. Buildings were burned or demolished, barnyard manure was dug up and removed, trees were cut, privies were disinfected, cellars were filled. The city's obsession with water purity left behind a stripped and silent valley.
Construction on Neversink Reservoir was largely shut down during World War II and resumed in 1946. On June 4, 1953, the reservoir began to fill. It took 2 full years to reach capacity. Neversink, the town, sank. The name was given to the reservoir that drowned it, and also to a new settlement built on higher ground nearby, which exists today along Route 55 in Sullivan County and has a population of a few thousand people. The new Neversink is close enough to the reservoir that you can see the water from the road. When drought drops the reservoir low enough, residents have reported being able to see ruins of the original town beneath the surface. The town that was told it would never sink has been sunk for more than 70 years, and the reservoir they built on top of it still carries its name.
On to number 3, Union Grove, Delaware County.
Union Grove was the smallest of the 4 communities drowned by the Bittersweet Reservoir in Delaware County. About 70 people at the time of the condemnation proceedings, but it had been there at least the 1857 opening of its post office, and it carried within it the quiet weight of a place that had been continuous for nearly a century before New York City decided it shouldn't be anymore. It had a Methodist church with an annual Christmas pageant, a general store, a post office that served farmers across the surrounding hills. When condemnation letters arrived in 1947, the post office had been operating continuously for 90 years. The last Christmas pageant at the Union Grove Methodist Church was covered by local newspapers as one of a series of final curtains. Events documented the way you document things you know will not happen again. The Catskill Mountain News ran an almost weekly accounting of these lasts. The last mail at Union Grove Post Office, the last service at the church, the last auction at a farm that had been in the same family since 1887. Bittersweet was to be New York City's largest reservoir by volume, holding 140.2 billion gallons, supplying roughly a quarter of the city's daily drinking water. For that, the Union Grove's Christmas pageant was one of the things that had to stop. The Downsville Dam was completed in 1954. The reservoir filled fully in 1955, and Union Grove, along with Arena, Bittersweet, and Shavertown, went under. In all, 974 people were displaced, and 2,371 bodies were exhumed from 13 cemeteries and reinterred elsewhere. The Bittersweet Reservoir is 15 miles long, 160 feet deep at its maximum. Somewhere near the bottom, a Methodist church once held its last Christmas pageant.
Up next at number 2, Arena, Delaware County.
Arena's story is the one the newspapers covered most closely because Arena was a town that held out longest, and because the images of what happened to it in the final years were striking enough to become something like folklore. Arena, originally called Lumbertown when it was settled in 1784, renamed Arena around 1990, sat at the lower end of the East Branch Delaware Valley. It had grown up around the timber trade, then survived the timber trade's collapse, and by the 1940s had become a modest dairy community with a central role in the valley's social life. The postmaster of Arena for 32 years was Catherine Dixon. When the condemnation letters arrived, she did what the wealthier residents could do. She moved her house. In November of 1955, Dixon's 12-room home was loaded onto a 21-wheel trailer, hauled by 2 Caterpillar tractors across the East Branch, up the East Bank, and transplanted in the nearby hamlets of Dunraven. One of the reporters covering the process described it as the house sailing across the water, with the aplomb of a steamship. The people who couldn't afford to move their houses watched them burn or get bulldozed instead. In December of 1953, the Oneonta Star reported that the inhabitants of Arena were decorating their homes and putting up Christmas lights for the last time. It is that detail, the last Christmas lights, that tends to stay with people who encounter this story. The house-by-house sale of every structure in Arena for relocation or scrap was itself a documented event, covered in the local press with the gravity it deserved. When the Downsville Dam closed and the Bittersweet Reservoir filled in 1955, Arena disappeared beneath what is now up to 160 feet of water. Today, brown trout moved through the streets where Catherine Dixon once sorted mail for 32 years.
And now, number 1,
Shavertown, Delaware County. Shavertown was the hub of the East Branch Delaware Valley, the largest of the 4 condemned communities, the one with 3 general stores, 6 gas stations, 3 churches, and a barbershop. It had acid factories that once produced wood alcohol from the forests of the surrounding hills. It had Cox's Mill, which appears in postcards from around 1910, a tidy structure on the creek that looked like it would be there forever. It had been, in the words of local resident Alice Jacobson, whose memoir survived the flooding, the most scenic and enchanting valley along the East Branch of the Delaware River. What Shavertown had that the other 3 communities didn't was volume. When New York City began condemnation proceedings in 1947, roughly 250 of the valley's 974 displaced people came from Shavertown. Farmer Jack Bow, whose 600-acre farm in Shavertown was purchased by the city for $30,000 in 1947, said in an interview, "When the city first came up, I realized that we would have to go. I made what I thought were the best possible arrangements. They were fair, and they treated me well. Now, as quitting time gets closer, the thought of leaving my home, the buildings I built, and the place I raised my family makes me sick." The Catskill Mountain News published 12 verses of poetry by a Shavertown resident as the flooding approached. The last mail at the Shavertown post office left on the same day as the last trip on the Delaware and Northern Railroad, which was also being drowned by the reservoir. A Shavertown woman who wrote a personal memoir of the valley titled it in full, "In Memory of the Most Scenic and Enchanting Valley Along the East Branch of the Delaware River and All Who Live There." She was 18 years old when her family's farm went under. She wrote that the valley should never be forgotten. She lived to 95 years old and never stopped talking about Shavertown.